Now, Ric's been working with the museum for years. He's been coming here. We have the closest surviving aircraft to Amelia's aircraft. Ours is 2 serial numbers away from hers. So every once in a while he calls us up or stops by to compare a part or something. So it's great that we're still actively involved in this, and we're grateful that he came and grateful that he didn't cancel out on us after all this new celebrity. But the first thing we want to do is long overdue, officially make Ric an honorary NEAM, New England Air Museum member, and get the official hat. So we want to
thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And I want to reciprocate and give the museum a copy of my book, Finding Amelia, The True Story of the Earhart Disappearance, for your research library.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And are you going to sign it for us later?
I will, of course, sign it for you.
And by the way, this is no small thing, because this is the last of a small batch of hardcovers left. And we're honored to have this for our research library. And I understand that later he's going to be selling the last of the hardcover batch here today. So I hope you guys have got your running shoes on. I'm going to hand it over to Ric. Thanks so much for being here.
Okay. Let me put away some toys here. Beautiful. Okay. First of all, again, I would love to thank the New England Air Museum. They've been so wonderful to Tiger over the years. And I always enjoy being here. And I hope all of you contribute to support the New England Air Museum. What they do is important. And what we do is important too. How many Tiger members do we have here tonight? Oh, yeah. Great Tiger members. How many pilots do we have here tonight? We have pilots too. While we're at it, any veterans from the 1st Cavalry? Oh, well. Anyone from Scotland here tonight? Oh. Leslie Wiltshire. Quid mil falce. Leslie, why don't you stand up for a second, if you would, please. Mr. Leslie Wiltshire is a veteran of the Coast Guard unit who was stationed on Gardner Island during World War II. And Nico Mororo, but you knew it as Gardner Island. It was Unit 92, Loran Station, and Les has been very useful and helpful to us in clearing up some things that we didn't understand about the Coast Guard unit and what they were doing and what they saw and what it meant. He's been a very important part of this investigation, and I thank him for it. Thank you. Okay, so let's get to it. You've probably seen this picture before. And I had seen it before. And I looked at it and I said, well, first question is, where did it come from? And it came from the National Archives, records of the Office of Naval Intelligence, Record Group 38, monograph files for the Pacific area. And it appears to be a picture of just what the caption says it is. PL means place. It's the Marshall Islands. This is Jallouet Atoll, Jallouet Island, Jallouet Harbor, and this is Office of Naval Intelligence number 14381. This is a file of material that U.S. intelligence had put together prior to the American invasion of the Marshall Islands in 1944. And the U.S. didn't have much information about the Marshalls, so they were grabbing data from wherever they could find it. And it's perfectly natural that they would go to, in fact, I looked at this and I said, well, that's not a normal ONI caption. It's obviously been pasted on there. So this is probably a picture they grabbed out of a published book somewhere that showed Jallouet Harbor. You need that information. But gosh, I said, finding the book that it came out of, how could we possibly do that? There are dozens of tour books about the Pacific. Well, fortunately, I didn't have to. The blogger in Japan found the book in the National Library of Japan, just as good as being in our national archives. It's a tour book, and sure enough, there's the same picture in the book. And the book is published in 1935. So 2 years before Earhart disappeared. No matter how many experts, supposed experts, you line up that can recognize faces, and you can talk about the ship, and you can talk about whatever you want to, and argue back and forth about why there are no Japanese guards in the picture, if this is Earhart and Earhart in custody and all that. You can argue that all day long. But fact is, the picture was taken 2 years before she disappeared. It cannot possibly show anything to do with Amelia Earhart. Okay, so moving right along. But it's legitimate to ask, and many people have asked, what about all that other evidence presented in the History Channel show? Okay, it's a fair question, and we should address that. Let's do a fact check, because you can't draw valid conclusions from bad facts. And let's see if they got their basic facts right. The Electra had 1,151 gallons of fuel aboard. Well, it's true that that was the airplane's total fuel capacity. But it's also true that there are two contemporaneous written sources from Lae, New Guinea when she took off, one by the manager of Guinea Airways, the other by the Director of Aviation for the Territory of New Guinea, who described that she had only 1,100 gallons aboard the airplane, and they explained why. She liked to use 100-octane fuel for takeoff because you could get more horsepower out of the engines with 100-octane. But 100-octane was hard to get, and Lae didn't have any 100-octane. She had one 100-gallon fuel tank that was only half full of 100-octane, and she didn't want to dilute that with the 87-octane that was available in Lae, so she didn't top off that tank. So she only had 1,100 gallons. We know that. That's well documented. So they got that wrong. A southeast wind blew them off course. All of the wind reports for the area, the forecasts and the reports from Howland Island describe an east wind and a northeast wind, and the after-action Navy assessments, it was all east wind, northeast wind. There was no southeast wind. So they got that wrong. There was a storm northwest of Howland. This is a very common misconception. The clouds at Howland that day were at 2,000 feet. It was a scattered deck, and they were a little thicker off to the northwest. It wasn't a storm, that the clouds were just a little, they went from scattered to broken to the northwest. After the search failed, the Coast Guard speculated that maybe she had been up there where the clouds were thicker, and that's why she didn't see Howland. And over the years, this has grown into a myth about a storm northwest of Howland, but there was no storm. So they got that wrong. Mealy Atoll is 281 degrees from Howland. Kids, you can do this at home. Mealy is 296 degrees from Howland, and that's true. And if you adjust it for deviation for the compass heading, it's another 10 degrees the other way. It's just not true. Okay, the transmitter was in the nose of the Electra. Man, this is basic stuff. The transmitter in the Earhart aircraft was back in the cabin on the floor behind the fuel tanks. A piece of aluminum could be from the Electra. Well, yeah, it's a piece of aluminum, and they had it tested, and the testing they did looked legitimate. And it was found to be an alloy that could be on an airplane, but not on the Electra. Wrong alloy. The alloy aluminum used on the Electra was stuff called 24ST L-clad. Wrong aluminum. Can't be from the Electra. And that Japanese ship, the Koshu, picked them up at Mealy. It does appear to be Koshu in the 1935 picture. Koshu was a Japanese Navy survey ship that spent a lot of time out in the area, and it was in and out of Jalua quite a bit. But Koshu's logs still exist, and they've been examined. Koshu was the Japanese Navy ship that did search for Earhart. Japan volunteered to assist the U.S. in looking for Earhart. The U.S. gratefully accepted their assistance. It was one of the rare things that the U.S. and Japan cooperated about at that time. Koshu looked around, didn't find anything. There is nothing in Koshu's logs about going to Mealy Atoll, about towing a barge. She was never anywhere near Mealy. So that's not right either. All right, well, all right, so they get their facts wrong. But what about all those eyewitnesses? I mean, these people who saw things and remembered things. Well, how many eyewitnesses you want? That's my stack of people who have said that they saw Amelia Earhart in Japanese custody, or soldiers who heard that Amelia's story after story. There are hundreds. And what people who support the Japanese capture theory have always done is cherry pick from among these anecdotal recollections and construct a narrative that fits what they want to think happened. It started in 1960 with Paul Brian's book, the Daughter of the Sky, in which he said that she simply read her compass wrong and flew to Saipan instead of Howland Island. Okay. Then along comes Fred Gardner, kind of the patron saint of Japanese capture. In 1966, this was a bestseller, Amelia Earhart. And he felt that, and he wrote in his book that she had landed at Mealy and then later taken to Saipan, et cetera, et cetera. And then Vince Loomis comes along in the 1970s, and he comes up with Billy Manamuran, the guy that was interviewed, who said he treated Noonan for an injury and all that. And then Buddy Brennan found dug where somebody said she'd been executed, and he found a scrap of cloth that he said was the blindfold used on her in our execution. And then Randy Brink, and then George Carrington. Oh, this is a good one. 1970, a fellow named Joe Gervais saw a woman at a garden party out on Long Island and took one look at her and said, "My God, that's Amelia Earhart." And decided that Amelia had been returned to the United States with a secret identity after World War II and was now living out her life as a New Jersey housewife named Irene Bolam. And he published the book, Amelia Earhart Lives. McGraw-Hill, the Bolams, of course, sued, and they settled. Never disclosed, but it was rumored to be in the neighborhood of $1 million. McGraw-Hill pulled the book off the market. It's not like a collector's item, but there are still people who maintain that Irene Bolam was Amelia Earhart. Tom Devine saw the Marines burn her airplane at Osleo Airfield on Saipan. Stand By to Die, that's another Irene Bolam book. And on. She survived. Let me know when you want me to stop, folks. There's Irene Bolam again. The Last Days of Amelia Earhart, and this guy, and this guy. And we'll end up with Mike Campbell, who talks about the establishment disinformation. And as a matter of fact, in a recent blog posting, Mike referred to TIGHAR as the despicable establishment protectorate. And our board of directors loved that so much we had t-shirts made. But okay, serious for that. What about the two Marines who dug up Amelia's grave on Saipan? This guy, Mr. Cathera, investigated that, and that took up the last whole bit of the History Channel show. Well, didn't that happen? Well, here's a letter from 1992 from the Department of the Navy's chief historian replying to Donald Cathera's wife, who apparently filed the Freedom of Information request. And I'll just read the last paragraph. As we have indicated to researchers in the past, the Marine Corps conducted an extensive investigation in 1965 into the allegations that Marines were involved in the excavation of a grave on Saipan, believed to be that of Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan. Official Marine Corps files were examined with negative results. Officers who were present on Saipan during World War II and who would have known if such an excavation took place were also queried and provided written statements that to their knowledge there was no such excavation of remains. Well, to a conspiracy theorist, that's proof that it happened. Why Amelia Atoll? All these stories about the barge went to Amelia Atoll and they found airplane parts at Amelia Atoll. Where did Amelia Atoll come from? Well, in 1989, Fred Gardner wrote to a Tiger member named Rob Girth and explained that I truly believed the north of course theory was the most probable at the time I wrote The Search for AE in 1966. And I chose Amelia as the most logical landing place. And then he describes who he talked to that convinced him, consequently satisfied me, that Amelia had not been the landing place of the Earhart plane. It is more than a little surprising that Vincent Loomis, Oliver Knaggs, Buddy Brennan, Paul Bryce, Jim Slade, and all the other people who visited Amelia in the late 1970s and early 80s, this has been going on for a long time, and made such extravagant, unsupportable claims did not even attempt to contact me before they made their expeditions. It is almost as if they did not want to hear anything which might not support their conclusions and what they were trying to promulgate to their investors. Sound familiar? I mean, this has been going on for a long time. But for real, could Earhart have landed or crashed anywhere in the Marshall Islands? Is that even a possibility? Well, let's look at what we know. We know how much fuel she took off with, and we know how much fuel she should have had in a best case scenario based on the power management recommendations that Lockheed provided. And we know from the strength of the radio signals heard by the Itasca that when she was 20 hours and 30 minutes into the flight, she had to be within 200 nautical miles of Howland Island. That's the blue circle. And we know that she had a total of about 24 hours of fuel. So she had another 3 hours and 35 minutes of fuel. And we know in a best case, the economical cruising speed of the Electra at 130 knots, that red line represents her under the most favorable circumstances, the maximum range that our plane could reach. And she's still at least an hour short of Amelia. But of course, they have her having 50 gallons more gas than she had. So if you use the wrong numbers, you can come up with the wrong answer. The truth is, Earhart couldn't have gotten anywhere where the Japanese were. There were no military installations there for her to spy on if she had gotten there, and nobody there to capture her for spying on something that wasn't there. Now, where do all these witnesses come from? They're not lying. Here's what happens, and I've seen it time and time again, and we've been burned by it ourselves, so I've learned this the hard way. What happens with these people is something happens that sticks in their memory, an unusual event, maybe like seeing somebody executed, maybe seeing a woman executed. It's a traumatic event, it sticks in their mind. And years later, they learn that this event could have been related to some very famous event. This could be the key to a famous mystery. And they want it to be that. So their mind fills in the gaps and fits the scenario it needs to fit. And they come forward with their information. And so you have all these stories, absolutely sincere, but they're not accurate. Eyewitness testimony is, as any professional investigator will tell you, the least reliable of all forms of evidence. And we consider it the least reliable also, even when it agrees with what we want to think. If you can find hard documentation to support an anecdote, now you've got something. But without hard documentation, there is simply no way to know whether somebody's memories are accurate. So let's get down to business. Moving right along. Let's talk about finding Amelia with hard facts and sound science. And before I do, we'll do a short commercial about my book. As Jerry said, I have one box of these things left. We bought up all the hardcover copies when the Naval Institute Press went to paperback and Kindle. You can buy these things on Amazon for a lot cheaper than you can buy the hardcovers from me. But we've been selling the remaining hardcovers signed by the author for $100 for some time on our website. And I will sell them. I have the last book of 28 books here tonight, and I will sell them for $100 each to anybody who wants them. And if you don't, that's okay, because somebody will buy them. You know, but we are making them available today. Happy to do that. And I also have paper membership forms I'll put on the back table for joining TIGHAR. And I really want you to do that if what I say to you today makes sense, because we need your help. The thing you can do that helps us the most is to join the organization so that you receive our newsletter, receive our publications, and we can keep you up to date on things. That's what makes us strong. And that's what I want to thank all the TIGHAR members who are here tonight for doing, because without them, I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't have the information that I'm giving you today. End of commercial. What do we mean by hard facts? We mean historical documents, datable photographs, identifiable artifacts, no, we're not going to use any anecdotal recollections. Sound science, well, that's adherence to the scientific method of inquiry. We formulate and we test hypotheses. And the results have to be replicable. If I say something adds up to something, you should be able to do what we did and come up with the same answer. You shouldn't ever take my word for anything, never take my interpretation for anything. That's what science is all about. TIGHAR is primarily an educational organization. This is all about methodology. Well, let's talk about the mystery. February 12, 1937, Amelia Earhart announces she's going to fly around the world as close as possible to the equator. And on March 17th, she takes off from Oakland, California to go to Honolulu. But in taking off from Honolulu on from Pearl Harbor, Luke Field, Pearl Harbor, on March 20th, she loses control of the airplane and wrecks it. The airplane has to go back to California for repairs in April and May of 37. And then on May 20th, she sets off again, going around the world. This time she reverses direction and she's going west to east. And she goes on around the world until she gets to lay in the territory of New Guinea, which didn't amount to much at that time. She arrives looking pretty tired, June 29th. But by a couple days later, she's looking pretty good. Now, there's nothing more common than a picture in a book labeled the last known photograph of Amelia Earhart. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the last known still photograph of Amelia Earhart. It only emerged later, just earlier this spring. That's Frank Howard, the local representative for vacuum oil, but beside her, he just supervised the fueling of her airplane for the big flight to Howland Island the next day. Pay attention to that shirt Amelia's wearing. It's dark colored, probably brown. She loved brown. With white piping, and she's got a piece of paper in her pocket, and she's got a scarf. This video I'm about to show you is supposedly the video of her final takeoff. It's actually two pieces of film that have been edited together. One was taken on a test flight she made on July 1st, and you'll see her wearing the same shirt you just saw. And then she wears the, nope, I don't want to do that yet. I want to do this. Yeah, we're going to get to the video. There she is in that same shirt, and this is July 1st. And there they are getting aboard the airplane again, same short-sleeved shirt, and there's Fred. And then we have a picture of a bunch of folks, local folks, standing around in front of the airplane. And the next bit is on July 2nd. See, long sleeve shirt this time. Engines are running. They get aboard the airplane. They taxi out. And they go on up to the end of the runway. Then they come blasting back past. And this airplane is really heavy. Ooh! Ground effect. And off she goes. 2,556 miles to Howland Island. It's going to take an estimated 19 hours. Well, this is what the Pacific looked like politically at that time. She's flying almost entirely over British territory, the Western Pacific High Commission, within which there is the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony, and within that is the Phoenix Islands settlement scheme, which is really not up and running yet. She's headed for the American Equatorial Islands, Howland and Baker, and then Jarvis Island is off to the right. And the other American possession is down here in the corner, American Samoa. The Japanese are up there in the Marshalls in the Mandated Islands, 800 miles from Howland Island. She's going nowhere near. And that's her destination. That's what Howland Island looks like. It ain't much. You know, it's about 1.25 miles long by about 1 mile across. Standing by is the Coast Guard cutter Itasca, commanded by Werner Thompson. And as Amelia draws closer, they hear her transmissions, but she's not replying to their calls. And Itasca thinks that she's just blowing them off. They're kind of upset about it. The lady is just ignoring us. You know, she's so arrogant, know-it-all. And at 7:42 local time, they hear her say, "We must be on you but cannot see you, but gas is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio." Whoa, she didn't hear any of that stuff we were saying. We are flying at 1,000 feet. Why is she flying at 1,000 feet? Well, that's why. This photograph was actually taken about 15 miles west of Howland Island at the same time of day, same time of year as her flight. And you can see where the clouds are. If she's up on top of that scattered deck, she can't see the surface of the ocean. She's just got a white carpet out in front of her. To see anything, she's got to get down below, and then the cloud shadow. Howland Island is in that picture. Can you see it? It's there. It's that farthest cloud shadow out there, darkest, but very difficult. And then an hour later, they hear her say, "We are on the line 157337. Then a few minutes later, running on line north and south. And that's the last thing they hear. A massive sea and air search, didn't find any trace. At the end of the search, the Navy decided, the commander of the Lexington group, they thought that the most probable thing was that about 9 o'clock local time, the plane landed on the sea to the northwest of Howland Island within 120 miles of the island. Well, all right, what are the theories? Crashed and sank, okay? Captured by the Japanese. Landed and died as a castaway. Let's look at crashed and sank. That's the default explanation. It's a tiny island, big ocean, limited fuel. Makes all the sense in the world. That's what I thought happened before we started doing research. Trouble is, there's no supporting evidence. There's nothing. She never said, I'm going down, I'm out of gas, She said she's running low on fuel, but what's that mean? You know, that can be interpreted lots of ways. There's just no evidence. Captured by the Japanese? Well, there are all those anecdotal recollections, but we know what they're worth. And it's a false premise with no supporting evidence, no documents, and no photographs. Landed and died as a castaway? Well, let's go back to see what the Navy thought. The night after she disappeared. She had, after noon on July 2nd, 1937, everybody knew she has to be down somewhere. And the Navy got together, naval aviators and experts, got together at Fleet Air Base Pearl Harbor, and they looked at what was known and said, well, she said she was on this line, which is very clearly something called a line of position that apparently Noonan had taken, had advanced through her destination, exactly what he should have done, and that they were running on the line north and south. Well, we know she didn't get to Howland, so it would make sense for her to run on the line toward where there was land, down to the south, because to the north, there's the closest thing you get to is the Kamchatka Peninsula in Siberia. So we had to send a battleship down to look along that line to the south of Howland. And that's what they did. They dispatched USS Colorado from Pearl Harbor down to, it had 3 catapult-launched float planes, and Colorado's orders were to search that line south of Howland. Meanwhile, people start hearing radio distress calls from the airplane, and they're widely believed and checked out and considered to be genuine. Consider this. These are from the Itasca logs. At 6:25 p.m., now she has to have been out of gas for 6.5 hours. Okay, so the airplane is down somewhere. We hear her on 3105 kilocycles. That's her frequency, a frequency that only U.S. registered aircraft talking to a ground station can legally use. Very weak and unreadable voice. But these are the same people who have been hearing her in flight, so they know what her voice sounds like. And then the British cruiser Achilles hears dashes on 3105 in response to the request, and then KHAQQ, which is her radio call sign. And a ship, the New Zealand Star, hears those dashes also on 3105. And this, again, is 6.5 hours after she has to be down. And then in Amarillo, Texas, Mabel Larimore is listening by accident on a harmonic of Earhart's primary frequency, 3105. And she hears intelligible voice, and she hears Amelia say, plane down on small, uninhabited, uncharted island, part on land, part in water, navigator Fred Noonan seriously injured, needs help immediately. She has some injuries, but not as serious. Okay. The radio operator on Nauru hears signals that he recognizes her voice, but he can't make out what she's saying. A ham in Melbourne, Australia hears something. And then the government radio operator on Baker, this is 8:20 p.m. the next night, he says he heard KHAQQ, her call sign, on 3105, strength 4, readability 7. That's 4 out of 5 and 7 out of 9. This is a clear, strong signal by a government radio operator who heard her call sign on her frequency. And then Dana Randolph, an African-American boy, 16 years old, in Rock Springs, Wyoming, hears, this is Amelia Earhart, and this is 4 a.m. on July 4th, local time in the Pacific. Ship on a reef, southeast of Howland. Well, this is a little different. Everybody has been thinking the airplane's floating around out there calling for help, and Dana says that she says her ship is on a reef southeast of Howland. And his signal is checked out by authorities and found to be credible. So Pan American Airways gets into the act with their direction finding station on Oahu, and they take a couple of bearings, and I don't know, one goes one way and one goes the other. They're hearing these signals too. And Midway, the Pan Am station at Midway, takes a bearing, and that's not much help. But then Oahu gets another one, and okay, now we're starting to get some, wait a minute. Midway gets another one. And then the Coast Guard takes one from Howland, and that crosses. And then wait, hey, now we got a consensus here of what's going on. Now this was well known at the time. This is the map that the 14th Naval District at Pearl Harbor was using to manage the Earhart search. The map still exists. And you can see that they've plotted the lines of the Pan Am bearings and there's Howland and Baker right in the middle. But they got a problem because their map ends 2.5 degrees south of the equator, and these lines seem to be converging off their map. So their solution to this is to cut off the top part of the map, flip it over, paste it on the bottom of the map, and hand draw the lines of latitude, longitude. And so they can see where these lines cross. And they plot in by hand the locations of the islands that are down there. There's McKeon Island and Gardner Island. Okay, so these signals seem to be crossing down there near Gardner Island. And then Lockheed chimes in. Information just received from Lockheed Aircraft Company states positively airplane radio transmissions could not operate, transmitter could not operate if plane in water. The radio's going to be wet. Radios don't like to be wet. So this airplane is on land, and it's probably on land on Gardner Island. So we better get those airplanes down there and find her. And there's the Colorado. They refueled Itasca on the way on July 7th. It takes a while to get down there. It's 2,000 miles from Hawaii. I've done it. It's a long trip. And you can see the planes on the aft of Colorado. And on July 9th, they launched their 3 Vought Corsairs. That was the name that Vought would use again. And they fly over Gardner Island. Now, by this time, the mysterious radio signals have stopped. But they fly over the island. They don't see an airplane. They do see signs of recent habitation that were clearly evident. They were under the assumption that all these islands had native work parties harvesting coconuts. There have been no work parties of any kind on this island since 1892. There should have been no sign of habitation. They didn't know that. They looked for an airplane, no airplane. For the signals to be genuine, there had to be an airplane. Therefore, all those radio calls must have somehow been bogus, and the rest of the Navy search took place. The planes from the USS Lexington took place in open ocean. The purple areas are the areas covered by Lexington and Lexington's planes. The pink areas down here are what was covered by Colorado and her planes, and they spent a total of 20 minutes to a half an hour over the one place where all the evidence pointed, and they wrote it off. Well, let's analyze this. Let's just not make any assumptions here. This is Nicomaroro, then called Gardner Island. It's a classic South Seas atoll. That's what it looks like from space. It's about 3.5 miles long by about a mile across the widest part of the lagoon. That was the current map of Gardner available in 1937. So they didn't have very good information about what Gardner really looked like, even if they had a map like that. This picture was taken December 1st, 1938. You can see the shipwreck. There's a British freighter that had run aground on the reef in 1929. And this was the first aerial photography of the island. The first work party arrived there December 20th, 1938. There they are. By 42, the stern of the ship had broken off, and there had been some clearing for a village made. And you can see the village, the British colony. The settlement was abandoned in 1963 due to a severe drought, so nobody has lived there for over 50 years now. It's all gone back to nature. That's what it looks like now. It's an absolutely beautiful place. That's all that's left of the shipwreck, but it's a very difficult place to survive, even if you're just trying to survive there to search for Amelia Earhart. But it is also now part of the Phoenix Islands Protected Area. It's UNESCO World Heritage Site because the reefs in this area are some of the most pristine reefs left in the world. And all this attention to this area as an important place for research, for climate change and reef health all grew out of TIGHAR's interest in Amelia Earhart. So this UNESCO heritage site can be directly attributed to Amelia Earhart. The Post lost radio signals. Hard facts. We looked at this for 12 years. There are 120 reported radio distress calls spanning 6 days, July 2nd through July 7th, and at least 57 of them are credible. That doesn't mean we're sure they're genuine, but it means that we can't find any explanation for them if they didn't come from an airplane on that island. So we have a hypothesis that she made a relatively safe landing at Gardner and sent radio distress calls for 6 days. Why do we say she made a safe landing? Because, as Lockheed said at the time, she has to be able to recharge the battery that the radio depends upon if she's sending signals night after night after night, which she was. The only way she can charge the battery is to run an engine, and the only way to run an engine is if she's on her wheels. The prop has to clear the water. So she's made a landing, the airplane's on its wheels, calling for help for at least 6 days. Well, we've got 47 signals that are credible in one ham, and we've got 9 people around North America who hear her on a harmonic and hear intelligible voice, and they all report the same thing. The most interesting one is Betty Klenk down in St. Petersburg, Florida, 15-year-old girl, and she hears Amelia Earhart on her home radio shortwave set calling for help, and she's got a notebook by her radio that she uses to jot down the lyrics of her favorite songs. She starts transcribing what she hears, and it goes on for 1 hour 3/4, and what she writes down reads like the transcript of a modern 911 call. It's confusing, it's confused, but it does contain, and she hears Amelia calling for help, but she also hears a man with her who's kind of out of his head trying to get out of wherever they are. This would occur at about 10 o'clock in the morning on Gardner Island in a metal airplane out on that reef at 10 in the morning. The temperature in that airplane would be in the neighborhood of 130 degrees. And she said the man was acting like he had a head injury and he was desperate to get out of wherever they were. But there are things in Betty's notebook that are what we call occult information, things that make sense, but she couldn't know they made sense. Several places in the notebook, for example, she wrote New York, New York, or she said something that sounded like New York. And I asked her about that. I said, what's New York, New York? She says, well, that's the way I write New York City. She kept saying that, and I don't know why. That ship on the reef at Gardner is SS New York City. So we're going to test the hypothesis. If this is true, well, we've got to be tough here. There must be a place on Gardner the airplane could land safely. Relatively, there's got to be a place she can land. She's got to arrive with enough fuel to run the engine to charge the battery. There must be a reasonable explanation of why the aircraft was not seen by the Navy searchers or later inhabitants. Where'd the airplane go? And the transmission times of the credible signals must correspond to time so the generator-equipped engine could be run. Think about this. She uses her battery not only to run the radio, she uses the battery to start the engine. If she runs down that battery sending radio calls and then can't get the engine started, she's really up the creek. So it doesn't make any sense for her to even try to use the radio unless she's got an engine running. You start the engine first, then you run so that means the credible signals have to correspond to times when she could run the engine. Let's see if they do. There must be a place on Gardner where the aircraft could be landed safely. Well, I wouldn't go for that beach. That's kind of out. There are some places on the island where you could land an airplane. You can't land up there. That's full of crab holes. It's very soft. You could land down there. That reef is very pockmarked, too rough. You can't do that. That reef is pretty good. And there's a pretty good reef up there. Okay. So there are places. You got to have enough fuel. Well, this is something that hasn't been well understood. Because of an anomaly in her radio antenna, transmitting antenna, she couldn't be heard if she was on 3105 frequency, if she was within 80 miles of a station. There's like a donut between like 80 miles and a little over 200 miles is the only time she's got to be within that donut for her to be heard by the Coast Guard. So she's not right on top of Howland Island. And her best chance, Howland's best chance of hearing her as strongly as they heard her is if she's about 200 miles out. So this is what we speculated. It's speculation, what actually happened. The northeast winds did push the airplane south during the night because there was overcast. Noonan couldn't get his star sightings. We know that from the radio transmissions that she made. And he was able to advance his line of position through Howland, but he gets to the line, and that's when Amelia says, "We must be on you but cannot see you." Now, Fred would never say that. He knew that they had reached the line. He knew there was a chance that they weren't dead on course. And we're running north and south. Well, that's what they should be doing. They go north, but they don't go north far enough to even see Baker Island. So they turn around and they're heading south. And at the last time she's heard, she's about 200 nautical miles south. And she's got 3 hours and 35 minutes of fuel remaining. From where she is, it's an hour and 15 minutes to Gardner. Give her another 15 minutes to look the place over, decide the best place to land. She's got 2 hours and 5 minutes of in-flight fuel remaining. That's about 104 gallons. She's got lots of gas. Not enough to take off again and fly back to Holland, but she's got some gas on the airplane. Okay, so that checks off that one. There must be a reasonable explanation for why the airplane wasn't seen. Well, here's an anecdote for you. This is Emily Sekuli living in Fiji. She was the 11-year-old daughter of the island carpenter in 1940, and she talks about how she was on a walk with her father along the coastline up by the shipwreck, and just north of the shipwreck, her father pointed out some wreckage out on the edge of the reef that he said was the wreckage of an airplane, and it made a big impression on her. And she told us this story, and we thought, okay, this is an interesting story. Can you mark a place on a map where your father pointed out the airplane wreckage? And she marked the map right there. Okay, well, let's go there. Let's see if it's possible. Well, that's what the reef in that area looks like. You could land anything out there. It's great. Okay, that works. That whole area is like a runway, but that doesn't make Emily's story true. Is this really what happened? Well, 3 months later, the British get around to checking the place out for possible future settlement. They weren't looking for Amelia, they were just checking out the island. And one of the colonial officers took a photograph. He took many, many photographs, but a photograph of the western end of the island that showed the shipwreck. But in his photograph, and he didn't know it at the time, and we didn't know it for years, there's something that shouldn't be there. Something sticking up out of the water in the left-hand side of the frame. And our forensic imaging specialist, Jeff Glickman, Jeff and I actually went to Oxford University in London to get the best possible copy of this picture. And Jeff found that, hey, this looks like the wreckage of Electra landing gear. Is it possible that one of the landing gear assemblies of the airplane separated from the airplane and got stuck on the reef and was still there 3 months later? Could that happen? Well, it happened before to this airplane. When she wrecked the airplane in Honolulu, in Luke Field, I'm sorry, the airplane ended up sliding backward after the ground loop, and the right main landing gear assembly separated from the airplane and it came apart just like implied in this photograph from Gardner Island 3 months after she disappeared. Well, that was an awful lot of eggs to have in one basket, and I wanted some help on that. So I went to the U.S. State Department, who had offered to help, and said, I need an opinion from experts who don't have a dog in this fight. And they agreed to look at the picture and do their own research and draw their own conclusion. And they told me, we see what your guy sees. We can't be sure that's what it is. We don't have it sitting on the desk here. But that's what it looks like. Okay, but where is it? Right there. So that's how you validate an anecdotal recollection. So where are we? Yeah, that works. Okay, we did that. but the transmission times have to correspond with when she could run the engine. All right, well, there's the airplane sitting out there on the reef, and the tide's going to come in, and the tide's going to go out. And if it's above a certain level, she can't turn the prop, so she can't start the engine. If it gets up to the transmitter level, the transmitter's toast, and she can't make any further transmissions. So we survey the reef, we hindcast the tides. I say we survey the reef. I can't tell you how difficult that was, but we did it. And we hindcast the tides. The wavy blue line is the tide going in and going out over time. The dark area is night, the white areas are daylight. The green lines are credible post-loss signals, and the red lines are the propeller and gas limits. So you can see that at least for the night of July 2nd, 3rd, all the credible signals occur when the engine could be run. And the next night. And the next night. And the next night. It's uncanny. And the final one is early in the morning of the 7th, and then nothing. And the yellow line is when the Navy planes fly over, because the airplane had been washed over the edge of the reef by the rising tides and surf, and was no longer there to see. It was hidden under the surf. So, check, 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 check. The hypothesis is supported. Doesn't mean it's true, but it's supported by the available evidence. But what about Earhart and Noonan? 3 years later. The British get around to settling the island, and this guy is in charge. His name is Gerald Gallagher, and he's officer in charge of the Phoenix Island Settlement Scheme, which has the most unfortunate acronym in history. To his brother officers, Gerald was known as, oh, I see, piss. He had a sense of humor, they all did. He gets to the island in September of 1940, and on the 23rd, he sends this message to his friend, the acting administrator up in Tarawa. Please obtain from Kawata, the native magistrate from Gardner on the way to the Central Hospital, a certain bottle alleged to have been found near a skull discovered on Gardner Island. Grateful if you retain bottle in a safe place for present, and ask Kawata not to talk about skull, which is just possibly that of Amelia Earhart. Well, this is what Gallagher found. The red bones are the bones that were there. He concluded that the other bones had been carried off by the giant crabs that live on the island. There was a Benedictine bottle, part of a woman's shoe, part of a man's shoe, a sextant box with numbers, an inverting eyepiece that's from a sextant, some corks with bracelets, the remains of a fire, dead birds, dead turtle. He reports this to the headquarters in Fiji, and the High Commissioner, Sir Harry Luke, says keep the matter strictly secret and send everything to Fiji. It's September of 1940. What else is going on in September of 1940? Battle of Britain, the U.S. isn't in the war, the U.S. is still very isolationist, British relations with the U.S. are very delicate, and Sir Harry Luke is not about to get himself in the middle of this thing until he is very sure what he's dealing with. So he decides to keep this investigation entirely within Fiji. So the bones and artifacts are sent, they go to Tarawa first, and then they end up back down in Fiji. And when they arrive, Sir Harry's staff, Gallagher thought they ought to check the Americans for dental records. The the medical authority asked to ask the U.S. consul about numbers on the sextant, and the doctor said, "Well, send the bones to the anthropology department in Sydney, Australia." And Sir Harry Luke said, "No, we're not going to do any of that." Well, the doctor looked at the bones, and he decided that they were the bones of a European male. Okay. And the report, it's not Amelia Earhart. And they show the sextant box to Harold Gatty, who happened to be in Fiji at the time, and Gatty says, "No, wrong kind of Wrong kind of sextant. It's a mariner's sextant, and that's not the kind you use in an airplane. If they had notified the Americans, they'd have learned that Amelia had a man with her. They didn't even know that much. The Gardner Island had been a prime suspect location early in the search. They didn't know that. And that Noonan always carried a mariner's sextant as a backup. He used to write about that. It's well known. And the numbers on the sextant box show that it was the same kind of sextant Noonan used as a preventer. We've learned all that. So all this information, this whole event, was only known to about a half dozen people, and it disappeared. This is the lost evidence that the History Channel should have been writing about. It was lost until we discovered the original British file in an archive in England in 1998. And once we had that, now the bones and artifacts have apparently been lost. We're still hoping to be able to find them, but I don't think there's much chance we will. They were considered to be unimportant at the time. They were probably thrown away. But we gave the doctor's measurements, the measurements he took, to two modern forensic anthropologists. And they plugged it into the databases available now for assessing gender and ethnicity from bone measurements, and they appear to be consistent with a female of Earhart's height and ethnic origin. And there's archaeological evidence. Once we knew this had happened, we were able, after great effort, to find where on the island it happened. And cleared all that, and that was a job, to do an archaeological dig. And you do real archaeology, and you find stuff like this, artifacts that speak of an American woman in the 1930s. Most recently, Dick Jantz, working with Jeff Glickman, went back to the bone measurements taken by the doctor and saw the humerus and radius measurements, this is upper arm and lower arm, noticed something unusual. The castaway had an unusual ratio. It's called a brachial index. The castaway's forearms were unusually long compared to the lengths of her upper arms. Well, what was Amelia Earhart like? And through our forensic imaging specialist and photographs of Earhart, we could measure her brachial index. And it's identical. Now that doesn't make the castaway Amelia Earhart, but it means that whoever the castaway was a woman of the same ethnic origin, same height, and had some unusual physiological features that were shared by Amelia Earhart. And she had a box with her that was the kind that Fred Noonan used. Even the Smithsonian started to come off there. Oh no, she crashed and sank. So our most recent expedition has just returned. We had hoped that the dogs that were sponsored by the National Geographic Society would be able to find more bones on the island that we could get DNA from. The dogs did a great job. The dogs are remarkable. The dogs smell the scent left behind when human bodies decay, rot away. It stains the soil. They don't smell bone. They smell the chemicals left behind when a body decays. So if you're looking for an old grave, somebody has been buried and has rotted away in the grave, the dogs will alert on the scent of the decay, and if you dig there, you'll find bones. But in this case, the body wasn't buried. The body was laying on top of the ground and rotted away on top of the ground, staining the soil. But then the bones were carried off by crabs, chewed up by rats, and taken away by Gallagher, who picked them up and sent them to Fiji. So you go back to that spot, the dogs said, yeah, died right here. All four dogs agreed on that. They alerted by the tree where Gallagher said that he'd found the body, and on the hole where they had buried the skull, and Gallagher had later dug it up. But there's no bone there. They dug and searched, no bone. We do have one bone from that site. We found it by conventional archaeological means in 2010. that is the tip of a human finger bone. And we had tried to get DNA from that bone. When I say we, the University of Oklahoma Molecular Anthropology Laboratories in Norman, Oklahoma, tried to get DNA. Yeah, there's human DNA there, but it was too degraded to sequence. You couldn't get a match to a known Amelia Earhart reference sample from a family member. So we decided to stop trying rather than use up, because it is a destructive process, use up the rest of the bone. We'll probably try again because the technology has improved a lot in the last 7 years, and we may now be able to get a sequence. So we're going to try again there. We may be able to find those bones that were sent to Fiji. There are still rumors about where they're sent. We're running those down. There's a chance that we can get DNA from soil samples. This was National Geographic's idea. It's a real long shot. It's been done on like Neanderthal DNA from caves, but caves are cold and dark. DNA likes cold and dark. Yeah. DNA doesn't much like, there's not a lot of cold and dark on Nicomororo. So we're trying everything we can. There's one of our archaeologists, Don Johnson, collecting soil samples to try. Another thing that would work would be a piece of the airplane. And we know where to look. It's just real expensive to look there. We have to look underwater off the edge of the reef. We've tried several times. What we really need is some manned submersibles, but that's real expensive. It's all about money. So we're still pursuing every lead we can. That's not what I wanted to do. Bye, Kaylee. And I think we can wrap this thing up. We're going to keep trying. We've been at it for almost 30 years now, and we have learned so much that has never been known before. People say, well, you've been out there 11, 12 times and you haven't found her. Well, yeah, it's a process. It's not an event. You build a jigsaw puzzle a piece at a time. It takes a long time. It's a very difficult place to get to. And the archival research that's turned up such crucial information, like the bone file. It took us 10 years to find that file in England. So this is how you do this work. You don't find one photograph and decide it's the magic bullet. So I will be happy to take your questions. Sir.
About the radio transmissions, clearly she was broadcasting both before and after the landing. But it would seem that if she had seen an island, she would have said something like, hey, I see an island, and I'm trying to land there. I wonder if there's anything close to that kind of a transmission at the appropriate time, or anything you can say about that.
Yeah, yeah. For those who couldn't hear, the question is, she made transmissions when she was in flight. She made the transmissions after she landed. If she had seen, when she saw an island in sight, why didn't she say, hey, we see an island? Maybe she did. The Coast Guard didn't hear anything on her frequency after the transmission in which she said we're running on the line north and south. But in that transmission, she also said she was switching to her other frequency, 6210 kilocycles. Today we'd call it kilohertz. 6210, we know from experience, when she left Lae, New Guinea, she was making reports on 6210, and she was supposed to make transmissions of her position every hour. And that was during the daytime. She was using 6210, and we know that Lae didn't hear her until she was about 500-600 miles away. So apparently 6210 was not a frequency that could be heard until she was some distance away. And Coast Guard never heard her on 6210, probably because they were too close to her to hear that. Now, that said, Fred Gurner He's gone now, but while he was alive, he swore up and down that he saw in the National Archives a Navy report in which she was heard to say, while still in flight, "Island in sight ahead" at about 10:30 that morning. Now, I'd love for that to be true because that's about right. But there is no such thing in the National Archives now. Gardner thought that it had somehow been purged or lost or something. The National Archives doesn't lose stuff. I can't explain that. So I think it's just a confused report of another thing where she said ship in sight ahead back when she was on her way. But anyway, there's no solid answer to your question. Yeah, it would make sense for her to say, yeah, we see an island ahead. Maybe she did. Maybe Gardner heard what Gardner said he heard is right. Or maybe she did say it and Itasca just didn't hear her. No way to tell. Oh, sir.
Yes. Did you ever do any side scan sonar surveys around the
Boy, did we ever do side scan sonar. We did it once in 1991. And we got all the way around the island except the west end, and then they ran the fish into underwater obstruction and lost the fish, so we never, of course, that's how these things always go. And then in 2012, we paid Phoenix International $860,000 to do a side scan sonar survey of that western end. And we got a bunch of sonar targets. Every one we checked out turned out to be a coral rock. But we lost faith in the side scan sonar when we found the whole stern of the Norwich City wreck at 893 feet with a remote operated vehicle with a camera on it. We were just in that area and we stumbled across the stern of Norwich City down there at 893 feet. And Phoenix had their autonomous underwater vehicle with a side scan sonar. They had just flown over that area and hadn't seen the wreckage of the ship. And it's this huge stern to the ship. And we pointed it out to them and said, look, guys, you just flew over it. And we know it's there because we just saw it. And there's nothing on your sonar. Oh, well, we'll do another pass from a different angle. And yeah, now you could see it. That's the thing about side scan. It's a black art. It's sound echoes. And if you catch it at the wrong angle, you don't see it. It's like stealth, you know, and it's not reliable. And yeah, don't get me started. Sir.
Did you ever talk to this guy that found the Titanic? About
Bob Ballard?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Back.
He's not interested in.
Bob's way too smart to do this. Bob looks for things that he knows are there. But I will tell you that in 2012, when the U.S. State Department decided, that, based on this work they did on this photograph I told you about, they got all excited and said, look, we really want you to get out there this year with sonar and all the tools you need, and we can't give you money, we can give you all kinds of publicity. So they threw a big event at the U.S. State Department to announce our expedition. And I found myself on the dais with Bob Ballard, who checked over our research and pronounced it to be valid and good, and go for it, Rick, you know, go find her. Thanks a lot, Bob. And the Secretary of Foreign Affairs for Kiribati, that owns the country, and the Secretary of Transportation, Ray LaHood, and the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, and I were on the dais, and we all talked about all this, and we got a lot of publicity and raised a bunch of money, and we didn't get any money from the government. We've never gotten a nickel from the government, and I don't want any money from the government. But we weren't ready to do the expedition that year. We rushed it. They wanted us to get out there that year because they knew that Clinton would not be Secretary of State, even whatever happened in the election coming up, and they wanted, if Earhart could be found on their watch, they wanted it to happen then. And so the whole thing was rushed more than it should have been. And that's a long story, but yeah, we've tried side scan sonar. Sir?
The question has to do with navigation.
Yeah.
Why would they pick such a small island as a target when they're flying such a great distance at night no visible means of external references. Why not someplace in the Gilbert Islands? Hindsight being 20/20,
Yeah.
of course.
Can everybody hear the question? Because guys get a nice strong voice. Why pick such a, well, it's because the only airfield there was. There were no airfields in the Gilbert Islands, no airfields anywhere in the Pacific. The only reason there was an airfield on Howland Island is because in 1935, the Jean Vidal, who is the head of the Bureau of Commerce, commercial aviation, decided that the United States needed possessions as refueling for airfields for refueling stops, because there was going to be commercial air service between the U.S. and New Zealand and Australia. And so he grabbed these islands, the American Equatorial Islands, Howland being one of them, where he wanted to build these airfields. And then his friend, and some say lover, Amelia Earhart, wanted to fly around the world, and she needed to get across the Pacific. And her initial plan, believe this or not, was to take off from Hawaii and fly nonstop to Tokyo, 4,500 miles. No, 3,900 miles, but she felt she could get 4,500 miles range on the airplane. She couldn't get off the ground with that much fuel, so the plan was to take off with a partial fuel load, rendezvous with a Navy flying boat over Midway, and do air-to-air refueling over, air-to-air refueling over Midway. Now, she's going to do this flight solo at that point. And air-to-air refueling in those days was done with a hose that you dangle from one airplane. So she's going to fly the Electra and somehow get a hold of this hose. Well, she proposed this in a letter, actually her husband, Amelia, proposed this in a letter to President Roosevelt, who was a brilliant man, but he was not an aviator. And he just looked at this and says, well, it sounds like a plan. And he forwarded the letter to the head of the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, said, do whatever is practicable to help Mrs. Putnam. I would love to be a fly on the wall. When that letter was received, she wants to do what? And so the Navy said, all right, we could work on that, but it's going to take a lot of practice, and we're not going to pay for it. That's not going to work. It's not the budget. At which point Jean Vidal says, yeah, but this is my chance to justify building an airfield on Howland Island. Amelia can just fly to Howland Island, and we can prove that my idea works. So that's how the airfield at Howland Island came about. Sir?
Since her communications, it didn't sound like she was injured seriously. Is there conjecture as to how she actually died?
How did Amelia actually die? Well, Gallagher found the bones lying under a tree. So it looks like the person just laid down and died. So probably sick, weak. There's lots of ways to die on that island. I've tried several myself. And you can die of thirst, because the only water is what falls out of the sky, and if it doesn't rain enough. Now she did have systems worked out where she could collect water and boil it in a campfire. We found the evidence of that. We know how she did that. But if it doesn't rain, that doesn't help you. So you can die of thirst. You can starve to death even though you're getting food to eat. We found the remains of the little fish that she ate, burned fish bones and turtle bones and bird bones. But if you're expending more calories getting the little bits of food you can get than the food provides, you slowly starve to death. Or you can fall on the coral, and that's instant infection. Now, in my case, we were on top of it with antibiotics, both internal and topical, and I was okay after a couple of days. But without that, you can be looking at blood poisoning and you can die. So there's lots of possibilities there. The whole thing. Oh, and the other thing about the crabs, lay down to take a nap, and the little hermit crabs come scuttling out of the bush and say, oh, somebody needs help here. And if you're too far gone to move, but you're still alive, you can literally be eaten alive. It's not something you like to think about a whole lot. But it was not a nice way to go. This is a real tragedy. And it's a whole final chapter in Amelia Earhart's life that's heroic, and it ought to be known. You know, that's one of the reasons we want to get this final proof so that we're not arguing about this. This is something that should be accepted and known. Ma'am.
Did she ever send a message saying crash on island?
Did she ever send a message saying crashed on island? Well, she sent lots of messages. Some of them, she described where she had landed. Remember, she didn't crash. She couldn't have crashed, or she wouldn't have been able to. But she did make several attempts to describe the island where she was. And the History Channel show talked about 281 North Howland, very cryptic message. What does it mean? Well, the Coast Guard thought it meant she was floating in the water 281 miles north of Howland. Of course, she couldn't have been because she couldn't send a signal with it. But another interesting fact is if you're on Gardner Island and you can shoot the sun and get your latitude, you will find that you are 281 miles from the equator. 281 north, if the missing word is line, which is what may refer to the equator as line 281 North Howland, okay. You know, it's kind of a strange way to say it, but maybe. So, yeah, but she was clearly trying to describe this place where she was. Oh, sir.
Didn't the takeoff pictures show her losing her trailing wire
Oh,
antenna?
yeah. First of all, didn't the takeoff picture show her losing the trailing wire antenna? All right. Not the trailing wire. The trailing wire was never, and you'll read many places where she left the trailing wire behind in Miami. That's not right either. The trailing wire was on the belly of the airplane. It was wiped out when she wrecked the airplane in Hawaii. When they rebuilt the airplane, and she was no longer, and Harry Manning, the guy who knew how to use a trailing wire antenna, because it could only be used with code, and neither Earhart nor Noonan knew code. Without Harry Manning on, she wasn't going to be able to use code, so she didn't need a trailing wire. It was never reinstalled in the airplane. But there was on the belly an antenna supported on masts along the belly for her receiver. There was a separate receiving antenna. And the aft mast only cleared the ground by about a foot. And when at Leh, the airplane was loaded heavier than it had ever been, and it's a turf field at Leh. When she taxied out to go up to the end of the runway to take off, in that film, you can freeze frame it, and you can see that mast in place. The antenna is fine at that point. But when the airplane comes back by the camera, you look at that, and the antenna's gone. Somewhere in that process, and I think she gets up to the end of the runway, swings the tail around to line up with the runway, and any perturbation in the surface, she could easily bump that antenna on some hummock in the ground. It's going to knock the antenna off, and now you're dragging the wire by a broken antenna. And if you look in that takeoff film, there's a moment when a puff of dust appears under the airplane. And that might be that broken antenna snagging on the ground and ripping out the rest of the wire, which explains, with the receiving antenna gone, and she wouldn't be able to feel this in a 15,000-pound airplane, that she'd never feel that. But that would explain why she couldn't hear the Coast Guard. They could hear her because her transmitter antenna is fine, her receiving antenna is gone. So that explains that. Now, another story, anecdotal recollection. I'm giving a talk like this in Indiana years ago, and there's a gentleman in the audience who said, yeah, I was in the service during World War II and I was stationed at Lane, New Guinea, and I was talking to locals and they said, yeah, we weren't surprised when she disappeared because after she left, we found a great big length of antenna wire laying out on the runway. It's a story. I don't know if he's remembering it right, if it really happened, but it fits with the loss of the antenna is photographically proven. I mean, it's a case of now you see it, now you don't. That's what happened. So, yeah, that's the whole lost antenna thing. Sir?
What are your plans in the future?
Well, we're trying to figure that out right now. There are several directions we can go. We're going to keep trying with the DNA thing because that would be the smoking gun everybody looks for. I think we're probably looking at another expedition to the island with divers. I got a piece of metal, okay, 2015. Our dive team is working off the edge of the reef where that landing gear was seen in the 1937 picture. And they come across a piece of metal that is embedded in the reef. It's been there like forever. It's definitely metal. Check it with a metal detector. And they assumed at the time that it was shipwreck wreckage from the Norwich City. But in retrospect, we look at it, it's too far north to be Norwich City wreckage. It doesn't make sense. And there are accounts where they scraped at this metal with a dive knife and saw a shiny surface that quickly turned dark gray or black. And we later find out that, yeah, well, that's what happens with cast aluminum that has a very high magnesium content. That's how it acts. And the nacelle ribs on the Electra, the parts that failed when the airplane failed and Luke Field, the gear collapsed, those are cast aluminum with 10% magnesium. So I really want that piece of metal that's embedded in the reef. We tried to relocate it and recover it on this last trip, and the divers couldn't find it. It hasn't moved, it was embedded in the reef. It's just stuff is really hard to find out there. So we need to take another shot at that and find that. So, yeah, Jerry.
So Rick, is it your desire
Oh,
to
I'm sorry.
devote the rest of your life to finding Amelia Earhart? That's one question. Number two is, if she had such a strong radio signal for 6 days, how come they couldn't triangulate it?
Well, let me ask you answer your second question first. If she had the radio signals were so strong, why couldn't they triangulate it? They did. That's what those Pan American bearings were. Those were direction finders. That's why they thought she was there. But when they flew over the island and didn't see an airplane, they concluded that somehow those signals must have been bogus. They didn't come up with an explanation of why the bearings cross at that island. When you think about it, there are only two possible explanations. Either the plane was there sending signals, or there was a hoaxer who had the capability of transmitting on her frequency, who could mimic her voice, who knew she didn't know code well, and knew she wasn't going to reach Howland Island, so that they had the time to position themselves in such a remote location. I mean, come on. Okay, your first question. Do I intend to spend the rest of my life looking for Amelia Earhart? I sure as hell hope not. I'll elaborate on that if you'd like me to. Thank you.
On the picture, the photograph that shows perhaps a landing gear sticking out of the reef.
Yeah, I speak up a little bit, I'm sorry.
Yeah, on the photograph that shows the landing gear.
Yeah.
Now, if that had been ripped off during the landing, then the airplane would be sitting too low. And she wouldn't be able to
Right.
get the
Right.
engine.
No, the question is, if the landing gear sitting on the reef had been ripped off on the landing, she wouldn't have been able to run the engine. Okay. Well, this is what appears to have happened, and it's speculation. She lands on the reef. She's parked there for several nights, but as and of course we know at that time of year the hindcasting shows each time the tide came in, it came in a little higher, and then of course the surf added to that. So it reaches a point on like the 6th night, 7th night, that the water is strong enough on the reef at high tide that it actually picks the airplane up, because the airplane will float, although empty, picks the airplane up and puts it down again, moving sideways, just like it did in the ground loop at Luke Field, and that collapses the landing gear at that point. Now the radio signals stop. And now the airplane is sitting on its belly on the reef flat, and the waves come in and push it along the reef toward the reef edge, just like it slid along the ground, the crash at Luke Field. And the same thing happened that happened at Luke Field. The landing gear separates. Probably got, because it's still there 3 months later, probably got jammed in one of the grooves that are in the edge of the reef out there. And that's how it separates. But I don't think it happens on the landing. I think it happens in the process of the airplane getting washed off the reef. That's what makes sense to me anyway. You guys have been a great audience. I haven't caught anybody sleeping. I am going to go back to the table in the back, and I will have the TIGHAR membership blanks for everybody to take that would be interested in doing that, and I hope you do. And anybody who would like a book, I will be happy to help you with that. And I want to thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience.